So I've spent the past few weeks reading through this stack of modern fantasy books, and I was so curious to see how the landscape of fantasy has changed over the past few years. Up until a few years ago, I was a big fantasy reader. I grew up on fantasy fiction. Robin Hobb and Joe Abercrombie are two of my favourite authors. But for the past few years, I have just not paid any attention to fantasy. And now that I'm finally back in a fantasy mood, I dove head first into a stack of modern fantasy books. And I was so excited to see what fantasy looks like now. So let's talk about it. What does fantasy fiction look like in 2024? And also over here are a few fantasy books that I have read over the past few years and really enjoyed. Everything you see around me, with maybe the exception of the Terry Pratchett novel, these were all written in the 21st century, and I personally think they provide a wonderful overview of what fantasy looks like now and why it is such a beautifully diverse thing these days. That is the first and most important thing that I learned in my month of reading fantasy books. Fantasy is diverse, and I mean that in a few different ways. First off, there is the obvious. These days, in the 21st century, way more writers of colour, way more women, and way more queer writers are writing fantasy books. And speaking as a queer trans woman, that is wonderful. The diversity of writers and characters and stories in fantasy right now, it honestly makes my heart soar. I am so happy. But there's more to it than that. When I say diversity, I also mean diversity of stories, and also diversity of ideas and concepts and settings. For example, just over the past handful of years, we have seen two new subgenres of fantasy come into existence: cozy fantasy and romantasy. Now, from where I'm standing and from the research I've done, romantasy is mostly populated by straight people. There's not a lot of queer romantasy, and so I haven't been paying much attention to it. If you have good queer romantasy recommendations, please leave them in the comments. I do have one to talk about here, but that's it so far. And that same romantasy book is also a work of cozy fantasy as well. These genres exist now, and they're very popular. So when I say diversity within fantasy, I mean that fantasy stories no longer follow such a rote formula. Growing up as a fantasy reader, fantasy books so often ticked at least a few of the same repetitive boxes. For example, it might be Tolkien-esque, D&D-esque high fantasy with elves and dwarves. If a fantasy novel wasn't high fantasy and the world was just populated by humans, it would still often be a very Eurocentric world inspired by medieval European settings. And I'm thinking here again about my two favourite fantasy writers, Robin Hobb and Joe Abercrombie. And of course, fantasy books were often about sword-swinging heroes defeating some great evil. But when you take a look at some of these books, you don't just see a diversity of writers, you also see a diversity in the kinds of stories being told. In so many fantasy stories these days, the fate of the world doesn't have to be on the line. So let's take a look at the wonderful diversity of fantasy right here behind me. A great place to start is with The Poppy War, which was the debut novel by R.F. Kuang. Now, a separate video about this book is coming soon, so I won't talk about it too much. Now, I actually read this book around the time it first came out, when I wasn't in a fantasy mood, but so much of it caught my attention that I had to try it, and I thought it was fine. I thought it was okay. However, last year I read Yellowface and Babel, and I quickly came to realize that R.F. Kuang is one of the great writers of our generation. So I reread The Poppy War, and I'm not joking, this is now my favorite fantasy book. The Poppy War is a wonderful lesson in subversion, in the sense that it begins quite familiar. The first half of the book is set in a military academy, and it feels kind of rote fantasy. A young girl from a small nowhere village manages to pass an exam and get into an esteemed academy. She's bullied, she has to prove herself. One of her teachers is a quirky and strange, mysterious guy that of course she is intrigued by and wants to understand better. And then, without spoiling things, everything is entirely upended in the second half. the entire world changes. The Poppy War is an intensely political novel, heavily inspired by the destruction caused by the Japanese Empire to Taiwan, the Korean Peninsula, and China in the early decades of the 20th century. And while it is a fantasy novel, it is so intensely inspired by Chinese mythology, Chinese culture, Chinese geography and history. It is a book fueled by cultural experiences, by shared national trauma. It's a book about the ugliness of imperialism and war. And I could go on for hours, so I'll stop here, but The Poppy War is a great example of what fantasy is becoming, both in the sense of the diversity of inspiration being injected into the genre, and also in the sense of what kind of political allegories are explored by the genre. Now, I mentioned before about how we have new subgenres of fantasy in romantasy and cozy fantasy, and how the fantasy genre can kind of tell different kinds of stories as opposed to adventures against some great big bad evil entity, blah blah blah. The Goblin Emperor by Catherine Addison is a fantastic example of that, because this is a high court drama. Most of this novel is set in a palace. The protagonist is a young prince who was exiled from his kingdom. He is half goblin, but his father was an elven emperor. But the emperor has just died in an accident, as have our protagonist's two older brothers. And so Maya is the heir to the throne. He has to be pulled out of exile, given the throne, given the crown, and of course he has to learn how to be emperor. This whole book is just high court political intrigue. It shows that fantasy can tell any kind of story. Why not set an entire fantasy novel in a palace where a young prince has to just learn how to be emperor, learn who to trust, learn who he definitely can't trust, and also navigate all of the pitfalls of that role. Things like arranged marriages and visits from the delegates of foreign nations. When it comes to building an entire fantasy world, there is enough within a single palace and how the social and political machine operates to fill a whole novel. So why not do just that? Now, in the years that I haven't really been reading fantasy, one of the authors that I have paid very close attention to is N.K. Jemisin. I read the entire Broken Earth trilogy a few years ago and I absolutely loved it. She is a hero of fantasy fiction. And just recently I read The City We Became. This is a work of urban fantasy, but it's also a lot more than that. It feels, for example, like it could have been a comic book, because this is a story of superheroes, kind of. And it's also very, very smartly a Lovecraftian novel as well. Like, this book isn't just inspired by H.P. Lovecraft, but it takes Lovecraftian lore in a really interesting direction. And because N.K. Jemisin is a black author who very smartly weaves race politics into her fiction, it's breathtaking and very exciting how she takes a famously racist author and turns his world, his creations, his legacy into something else entirely. To say too much would be to spoil things, so I won't. But The City We Became is a wonderfully woke book. Our protagonists are immigrants, homeless people, queer people, black people. And that wokeness works so well in this book because it is in part a celebration of the diversity and multiculturalism of great cities like New York City. Comic book inspired, eldritch urban fantasy. There's nothing else quite like this book, and again it demonstrates the unpredictability and diversity of fantasy books these days. The cozy work of romantasy that I mentioned is The Honey Witch by Sidney J. Shields. Now, this book could also be called a piece of historical fiction because there are dates in it around the 1830s and it's got that Regency kind of vibe, but every single place mentioned in this book is fictional or at least semi-inspired by a real location. So it is very much fantasy. Maybe you could call it historical fantasy. And because it's fantasy, it doesn't have to adhere to the rules of historical fiction and at least be slightly accurate to its time and place, because it doesn't really have one. And that means that kind of unexpectedly, this book reminded me of Schitt's Creek, a show that is effectively set in a queer utopia. There's a lot of queerness in this book. It is a sapphic romance, and queerness is never challenged. It is entirely normalized in this world, and that was so refreshing refreshing. Yes, it is very important that queer stories reflect the struggles and difficulties that queer people face every single day in the real world, but it's also really nice to read a fantasy novel where queerness is ordinary, completely accepted. The idea of challenging it, of being homophobic or transphobic, just doesn't exist. I love that. And The Honey Witch is also cozy. It is mostly set on an island in a cottage where a young woman inherits her powers from her dying grandmother. She is the titular Honey Witch. She uses magic and herbalism and alchemy to heal people. She lives alone in a cottage and she helps the world be a better place. But she's also cursed never to fall in love. At first, our protagonist is thrilled about that because she's sick of being set up with men. She wants to escape normal life and go be a witch in a cottage. I get it, I feel it, I love it. But soon enough, she meets a young woman who at first she really doesn't get along with because this young woman doesn't believe in magic and witches and witchcraft. And so they're not exactly enemies, but there is a lot of friction between them, and eventually that friction will become something very different. And that means our protagonist suddenly has to realize that she does care about this curse because she's falling in love with a young woman, and that cannot happen. This is sapphic romantasy. It is also cozy fantasy. It is wonderfully charming, very, very sweet, and I fell head over heels for it, honestly. But so many of the fantasy authors of today are still paying homage to the legacy of the genre. If you want a fantasy novel that is a great grand adventure, a Tolkien-esque battle against an evil entity, you can still find that in things like The Ember Blade by Chris Wooding. Back when I was a massive fantasy reader, I loved Chris Wooding's work. His Ketty J novels are incredible, some of my favourite books in the whole world, and this is a love letter to the legacy of fantasy. It's very reminiscent of Lord of the Rings or The Wheel of Time. This is a massive 800-page epic fantasy adventure. And then we also have The Black Coast by Mike Brooks, which is a wonderful blend of classic, recognizable fantasy tropes and something entirely new and unexpected. And I really don't think this book is as popular as it should be, because like The Goblin Emperor, this book is doing something different with the fantasy setting. It is mostly set in a small town on a coastline where hundreds of people from a foreign nation, a nation that has previously tried to invade the coastline, are now refugees and have fled some sort of great evil that is plaguing their world. They've ended up in this small town, and most of the novel is about a clash of cultures between these two peoples. The people of the island archipelago and the people of the coastal flatlands are remarkably different from each other, and now they need to try and work and live together while knowledge of this strange evil thing that we know so little about just exists, just floating in the air above everything. What is going to happen with that? What does it all mean? But we spend most of the novel just watching these two cultures clash. And the exploration of cultural differences is so satisfying. I absolutely adored this thing. It is a big, chunky 600-page novel full of political and social allegories that get explored. It is wonderfully satisfying, but it still feels almost traditionally fantasy, but with a lot of really necessary, modern and exciting twists. Now, I've talked a lot about Yoon Ha Lee in a recent video dedicated to his writing, so I'm not going to dwell on him here, but Phoenix Extravagant is another great example of diversity that now is being explored in fantasy fiction. Like The Poppy War, this is very much a social, historical, political allegory, once again about the damages done by the Japanese Empire, but instead of being set in an approximation of China, Yoon Ha Lee is Korean American, and this is set in an approximation of the Korean Peninsula. Our protagonist is a non-binary painter, and that's another thing I really like, is fantasy protagonists don't have to be wizards and sword-wielding princes and knights and blah blah blah. They can be anyone. Set a book in a fantasy world, but have our protagonist be someone else. like a painter, but that painter still gets caught up in issues of government and colonialism and rebellion as well. This book is so smart and so satisfying, and it's also not very long. It's like 300 pages, which is another rarity for fantasy. And then of course I had to mention the works of Terry Pratchett because I just read Feet of Clay. Although to tell the truth, I actually didn't read this copy, I listened to the audiobook while I was at the gym. But Terry Pratchett, with his incredible legacy, created an enormous fantasy world populated with fascinating people. He told dozens of stories set in this world, and all of it is political satire or social satire about our real life issues. There was no one in the world like him. I don't know if there ever will be again. I just mentioned how a fantasy protagonist can be anyone or anything, and Legends and Lattes here by Travis Baldree is a wonderful example that there is such a thing as cozy fantasy where our protagonist is an orc barbarian who also happens to be a lesbian who retires from being a mercenary and sets up a coffee shop. Why not? Fantasy can be anything, and I think we're seeing so much proof of that now. Modern fantasy books are diverse in their voices, in their characters, in their stories, in their settings. We've come to realize over the past 20 years or so that fantasy is a vehicle for any kind of story, and also every kind of story. So many writers of different backgrounds are coming into the fantasy genre and writing some of the best things the genre has ever seen, and I am so here for it. I have so enjoyed every single book I've read this month, and I am now back on that fantasy train. I am going to continue reading very diverse, very exciting, very fresh takes on the fantasy genre. I'm so excited, and I hope you do the same. Please let me know in the comments some of your favorite modern fantasy books, because I need more recommendations. If you enjoyed this, you can support me on Patreon, and if for some reason you're skeptical of Patreon, I've now set up a YouTube subscription, which works almost exactly the same way. Many of the perks are identical. So if you'd rather subscribe to my YouTube channel than subscribe to my Patreon, it helps me just the same way. And as you know, I would appreciate any kind of support because Patreon is what keeps this channel going. Thank you in advance, and subscribe for books.